So, my name is Colette. If I say something that you don't understand, I'm really happy to, if you just shout out, what are you talking about? I'll gladly go into some details or back up or define things just because that makes it a lot easier. So the title of my talk is Behind Every Good Man, Women's Production and Reproduction Among the Hadza Hunter-Gatherers of Tanzania. And one of the reasons that I named it Behind Every Good Man is that currently I feel like a lot of evolutionary theories about human life history and particularly human reproduction really involve a lot of people helping women. Lots and lots of different kinds of people, arguments about who's helping women more. Women are just needing to be saved all the time in most of these theories. So what I'm going to do is talk about how my research relates to two particular theories, both of which make the argument that women, particularly hunter-gatherer women, needed a lot of help in the past to support their reproduction. So one of these hypotheses, I'm sure some of you have heard of them, they're very, very famous in evolutionary anthropology right now, is the grandmother hypothesis. And in this hypothesis, essentially, it's older women who are helping women and trying to help provide calories to these women, these mothers, to try and support their reproduction. And so the idea of this is that grandmothers essentially are people who have gone through menopause and they stop reproducing so that they can help their daughters and thus help their grandchildren. So they're investing, they're getting extra calories and so on and so forth. So the help in this model is coming from older women and specifically grandmothers. The second hypothesis is called the embodied capital hypothesis. And in this hypothesis, it's really fathers that are doing a lot. So I'll go under some of the same the assumptions of both of these. So we'll start off with the grandmother hypothesis. And there are some kind of key assumptions, really, in the grandmother hypothesis that I'm going to try and look at. So some of the assumptions in the grandmother hypothesis are that meat or hunting is not really a great provisioning strategy. So in this hypothesis, it sees males as not doing the particularly best thing to support reproduction. They're mostly, maybe possibly just showing off when they're hunting. They're not really doing it for the best reasons, and it's just not the best strategy. Other proponents of the grandmother hypothesis or other components of the grandmother hypothesis are that widespread sharing of women's foods really underpins female reproduction. And it's critical for women's reproductive success. It's critical for getting new generations of humans off the ground. And according to this, essentially, longevity is essentially selected for in women, in these grandmothers. And males are basically dragged along unwittingly, along with the whole selection on females to live longer. So this hypothesis essentially has men being dragged along genetically after women to live longer. The embodied capital hypothesis, although I say both these hypotheses have helping women to reproduce underpinning them, they argue with each other on quite a lot of different points. So the embodied capital hypothesis thinks that it's the widespread sharing of men's foods that really support reproduction. So it would be widespread sharing of meat and particularly hunted kinds of foods that really they see as being the evolutionary force underpinning human reproduction and human life history, the way we live, essentially. And along with this, they assume that better hunters kind of get a payoff in some ways because they have higher reproductive success. And they see actually all of human longevity as having to do with taking time to learn to hunt. They see the childhood that humans have, the specifically long period of time called the childhood, as part of what you need in order to train to learn how to hunt effectively. And they effectively see females as being dragged along in terms of living longer because it takes males so long to be able to do this hunting kind of strategy, which is a particular niche that supports all of human reproduction. So in this model, dads are important. Males are provisioning, and even if they're not necessarily provisioning a lot, they're having higher reproductive success because they can be having more affairs, more ladies, more because hunters are sexy, I guess. But alternatively, the sharing of their foods can just basically support the caloric needs for reproduction in the group. So what has been done with these two kinds of theories and these kinds of assumptions? Well, a huge amount of work has been done on how men's foods are distributed once they hit camp. And this list of references is just reasonably recent stuff, only on Hadza meat sharing. That's one food in one group. And so many people have been talking about this for so long. So a lot of that has been done. So we now understand how Hadza men's foods are essentially shared. A lot of thought has gone into large game hunting as a particular human niche. So a lot of people have been writing about that for years. And quite a few studies have shown that hunters and hunter-gatherer societies have higher reproductive success. So whether it's because of sharing or it's because they're sexier, and people argue about that, it seems that it's good to be a good hunter for some reason or another. So this is some of the previous work that's been done. Next, I sort of wanted to talk about what we think we know about the Hadza, what a lot of people think that they know about the Hadza because of the Hadza literature that's been out there for so long. A lot of people have claimed that the Hadza, this is the group that I'm talking about, and I'll be talking to you more about specifically a backdrop of who the Hadza are in a minute. A lot of people have kind of characterized them as being large game specialists, that they kind of would avoid taking small game if they can just go out a little bit longer, a little bit further, and try and get a large game animal, as being particularly focused on large game. A lot of people have documented that they share foods widely, that food sharing is a huge component of their lives. And in fact, just everything, sometimes it's characterized that they almost share everything. It's characterized conversely by some groups and other groups, big argument, whether it's grandmothers or dads, so the embodied capital hypothesis versus the grandmother hypothesis, that somebody is supporting human reproduction or female reproduction in the Hadza in a very, very big way. It's argued about who, but it's definitely somebody and not the women themselves in these theories. And again, it's been documented among the Hadza that better hunters have higher reproductive success. Although exactly why that's true, nobody's documented.
What's EPC?
Extra pair copulation.
Extra
Yes, affairs, flings. But essentially getting opportunities outside the realm of their marriage, because the Hadza are monogamous, which is rarely talked about as in any kind of very substantial way. But the Hadza are reasonably monogamous, and so some people say, oh, well, it's good to be a better hunter and you get higher reproductive success, but that's because of hooking up with other women who are not your wife. And other people say, no, it's because you're provisioning your wife and your offspring, and they live and they survive better. So this is sort of the backdrop. Okay, so here's what, and I say we, but I mean me today, but what my team has contributed. So things that I'm going to talk to you about today that we're trying to look at are the preferences for or importance of meat among the Hadza, the strategies of men, how much food is obtained but not shared. So I want to kind of look at what are men trying to do? Are they trying to provision and share everything? Are they not? What's the strategy there? And then the variation in reproductive success. And I want to look at that in relation to people's own productivity. And this is both males and females. So on to talking about the Hadza, in case you're thinking you missed out on that part. I started with the theoretical part first. The Hadza, in case you know of them, you're going to be very bored. You can tune me out now. So the Hadza are a group of hunter-gatherers. There are various assessments of who is Hadza and who is not Hadza. But the census kind of ranges around 1,000 to 1,200 Hadza in the world. And around 350 or 400 of them are full-time hunting and gathering and eating less than 10% of their diet from agricultural products. So essentially that means they're not eating any kind of corn or anything else like that unless they're trading with their neighbors for it. Very few of them, and none of the ones that I'm working with, are actually using domesticates that they have themselves. They're not growing anything. They're not keeping any livestock of any sort. So that means that they are highly mobile, and they live in an area where regionality is very important. So this can be in the same season in 4 different regions of Hadza land. You can get very different kinds of environments and climates. And so the kinds of things that you would run up against as a hunter-gatherer might be very different from one place to the other. And if things are very hard, let's say here, then they are very likely to just pick up and move on somewhere else. Likewise, Hadza land is very seasonal. So this is a photograph taken in almost exactly the same spot in the dry season versus in the rainy season. So it's dramatically different. And so these two things together, and along with just depletion of natural resources, mean that the Hadza move on average about every 6 weeks. They live in groups that are around 30 adults, although it changes, of course, by region and season and what's available and so on and so forth, but just on average to give you an idea. And these are typical huts, houses that they can make in under an hour. So they have no qualms about picking up and leaving because there's nothing that substantial or permanent that they would need to move along with them. So in terms of the sexual division of foraging labor, Hadza men, despite many people's adamant belief that a lot of hunting is done in a cooperative group sort of way, most Hadza men are hunting alone, especially encounter hunting. Sometimes they go in pairs or something like that, but almost never. It's fairly rare.
Sorry, how big are the animals they hunt?
They can be huge. I mean, we're talking about giraffes.
Okay. And one person would hunt a giraffe.
Yeah, and then what they would do is they would hunt a giraffe, and if they get the killing blow, they would go back to camp and get other people to help them carry stuff back to camp. But yeah, absolutely.
That's because of the poison arrows they can use.
Yeah.
That would have to be collected, wouldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, the poison, they do have poison on the shaft just below the tip of their arrows, and it can kill basically everything below the size of an elephant. Yeah, so they love James Woodburn because he used to shoot elephants for them. I didn't say that. Right. So this is a picture of a baobab tree. So men do encounter hunting, and a lot of focus has been on men's encounter hunting and men's hunting, for instance. But this is a baobab tree, and I want to make the point that this is a guy after trying to go out hunting, and he's coming back not empty-handed, but he's coming back with a handful of baobab, which is a fruit that also women collect. And what he's standing here next to is a huge baobab tree that has honey way up top. And if you can imagine the tree trunk being that big, you know that they got to climb very high into some of those trees, dangerously high, in order to get honey. So lest you think that hunting is the only risky thing that Hadza men participate in, it's not.
What's encounter hunting?
Encounter hunting is just you sort of walk out and you wait to see what you get, as opposed to you can be at a hunting blind where you're just sitting there. Essentially, encounter hunting is like you're going out and you don't know what's out there, but
Chance.
you're gonna chance. Essentially, if you're staying in a permanent water hole, you know something's going to come there eventually, so it's just a matter of time. But if you're out hunting in a walkabout situation, then you don't know what's going to happen. So, women, unlike men, are usually foraging in groups. And they acquire underground storage organs called tubers, which are basically like potatoes or something like that. And they acquire these almost every day. And they usually have tiny babies with them and older weanlings. And usually the kind of larger but can't walk very fast toddlers are left at home. Heavy, can't walk, can't keep up kind of kids. Sometimes men and women actually do forage together, particularly when they're getting berries or something like that. And I should also note, it's not part of my presentation today, but it's surprising how much kids can actually forage for themselves. They can get a huge amount of calories. You can just park some kids in front of some berry bushes and they'll basically feed themselves. So a lot of this talks about supporting reproduction and provisioning children. You need to keep that in mind, that sometimes kids can actually, they can do a lot themselves, actually. Hadza kids, at least. And this is just a picture of some Hadza foods. So when I'm talking about them, you kind of get the idea. When I try to tell people that the paleo diet is crazy, I have to talk about this a lot. So these things are berries, and essentially they're very high in fiber, and they're very low in sugar compared to a lot of the berries that we're more familiar with, like the strawberries that you brought, which are nice. And then here is a tuber. This is their most favored, basically, tuber, according to some interviews that I gave them. But again, it's so high in fiber that you can't just eat it. You have to chew on it for a while and then spit out the quid afterwards. It's not digestible, really, in the way that we usually think of these things. It still has calories, and it has liquid, which is very important if it's very hot and things like that. And this is baobab, and it's common across all of Africa, and it has this chalky, kind of pulpy thing, and it's very high in vitamin C. And the seeds from baobab have a lot of protein and fat, and they can be pounded into a pulp, and they're a great weaning food. And they're very high in calories, actually, as well. And so the take-home point of this is just, here's some examples of Hadza foods that are female-gotten foods, but also particularly baobab and some of the other berries can be a source of protein, just so you know. So I'm going to remind you what I was looking at theoretically, and then I'll go into my data. Dangerous, I know. So what we're going to try and look at is preferences for or importance of meat, strategies of men, how much is it obtained but not shared, and variation in reproductive success in relation to people's productivity. So, all right, so essentially for the preferences or importance of meat, what I'm really looking at here, the reason I'm looking at it, is that the embodied capital hypothesis essentially says that meat should be really important and extremely preferred for basically most hunter-gatherers, because it's really the thing that they think is shaping all of human life history. It's really the thing that's promoting longevity, it's promoting the childhood, it's supporting reproduction. If it's doing all this stuff, it must be important enough for people to really desire it and want it. So I asked 94 Hadza individuals in 7 camps over 2 field seasons, blah, 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 blah. Every time I show you this slide like this is just so you believe that I did science. They're numbers. I'll tell you what they mean. Essentially, what I found was that the black bar is not meat, it's honey. Honey. Everybody, women over here, men over there, everybody agrees. And that's weird. For Hadza to agree on anything is strange. But they agree. It's not meat, it's honey. They love honey the most. Now, here's the next kicker, which I did not expect. I'll be honest, I really didn't. Men found meat was the second most preferred food. But women thought berries was the second most preferred food. They put meat 4 out of 5. Which is pretty low ranking for this whole theory of meat for sex and various other things. I don't quite know why berries for sex is not a hypothesis. So I'll try and get that off the ground, I guess. Anyway, so essentially what I was thinking about when I was looking at this stuff is what is it that women want and versus what is it that they're getting. And essentially, men are getting things exactly in line with the amount of kilocalories they can get per hour of foraging for this thing. So they can get the most amount of kilocalories per hour if they go after honey, then meat, then baobab, then berries, then tubers. That's exactly what they do. Women, on the other hand, they get the most kilocalories per hour going after tubers, but tubers are not actually the highest in absolute kilocalories or anything like that. So at that point, you can see that female foraging is a different strategy. They're not just doing the kilocalorie per hour kind of thing. They're playing some other kinds of games here. So that's one of the things that I'm going to talk about later when I get into their reproductive success and so on and so forth. Now, here's another caveat. When we analyzed the amount of returns in relation to percent body fat and controlled for regions and seasons and stuff like that, we found that although women didn't really like meat that much, they didn't give it a very high rank, when a lot of meat was arriving in camp, they had a higher percent body fat. So they had a lower percent body fat when more tubers were taken. So again, this is something I'm going to discuss later.
So could you say about body fat? You wait a few weeks and see how fat people get after eating the meat.
No, it's actually, we're looking at exactly that camp during that time. And essentially, we're saying this many kilograms/kilocalories of these foods arrived. How are people's body condition? Now, yeah, you're right. There might be a lag in those things, but since we're staying in these data in camp for 6 weeks, you might see an actual effect. So, and the effect seems to be that meat is when more meat is taken, women have higher percent body fat, and when times where a lot of tubers are taken, women have a lower percent body fat. I guess I can just talk about that for a second. Yeah, so So one of the reasons that might be the case is when there are a lot of tubers taken, tubers are a fallback food. So that means that tubers are usually taken when other foods that are more preferred and more calorically dense are not available. So it's in some ways not that surprising that if women have to go out every day and get tubers, that means no other food is coming into camp, basically. They can't get berries, they can't get baobab, they can't get their more preferred foods even. Now, when a lot of meat is taken, women don't have to forage at all if you get a whole giraffe, so they can just sit on their butts and eat giraffe meat all day. This also could help with their percent body fat. So, for my testing of the assumptions, it seems that meat could actually be important. I'm leaving that as a question mark. It seems like getting help probably helps. So it's not a straight up, easy answer. No, I've counteracted that. It's done. It's maybe, I don't know. It's definitely not, meat is definitely not the most important food in the diet in terms of preferences, though. Not for men and not for women. So this is just an adjustment off of what other people have sort of said. All right. So, great. Meat may or may not be important, but what about strategies of then? How much of food is obtained versus shared, right? So we know that the assumptions are that almost all foods go back to camp to be shared, and that the sharing of particularly all meats are really important. That's kind of laid under these kinds of theories. So those are two main assumptions that a lot of different researchers of hunter-gatherers really make. So that's the science bit. It's a lot of hours of following men around. That's enough I'm going to say about that.
Sorry, did you follow them around, or did you get the male
I both. So some of these hours are Frank's, some of these hours are Brian Wood's, and some of these hours are me. And I did analyze whether or not there was any difference in rates of finding kills in Brian's data versus my data versus Frank's data, and there was no difference. So hopefully none of us, if we equally...
Just as well as Frank.
Well, yeah. So hopefully if there's an effect of the researcher, it's that all researchers are bad, basically. None of us is particularly bad, if that makes sense. So, so there's numbers, just to give you an idea. And forays they did last anywhere from 30 minutes to 12.8 hours. Yeah, it was a lot of time. So, man the provisioner. So what I found is that men on average are eating 2,206 kilocalories before they return to camp. What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Huh? So when they're out there solo hunting, they're eating a lot. And this is never talked about in any hunter-gatherer studies. So this is about 83% of what we estimate their total energy expenditure. Now, their total energy expenditure is not the same as their basal metabolic rate. It's their basal metabolic rate plus what they spend foraging on average. So they're really basically eating most of everything they need before they ever return to share anything. Which is not to say that they don't return sharing things. It's just to say that they kind of make themselves whole first, if that makes sense. And like I said, you won't find this in other reports of hunter-gatherer studies. It's a bit of a shocker because, and I'm probably going to repeat myself here, but almost everything everybody thinks they know about the hunter-gatherer diet comes from in camp, which means this is all missing.
Yeah. James did jokingly refer to this funny fact that everybody eats the stuff before they get home.
Yeah.
But just anecdotally, I don't think he did
Yeah.
quantitative stuff.
I mentioned it a number of times anecdotally too, and then I realized we need to know how much they're eating. But it's very funny. So I mean, there's a.
Is it any specific bits of the animal or?
There are some things like that, but I'm going to tell you about a little bit of it, now, and then I can totally dive into it more. So again, man, the large game hunter. I want to bring this into question too, because I kind of laid out there that Hadza are characterized as being these large game specialists. 82% of the calories that they ate out of camp were from honey. Only 16% was meat. And then of the game animals captured, and again, this could have changed over time, but what we found is 73% of all animal acquisitions were small game. So large game is actually the rarity and not the commonplace thing that this is talked about. So
That wouldn't be the men's preference, is it? Because they can't find that.
it could, I'm sure they would prefer a giraffe over a rock hyrax.
Yeah.
But I think they're being couched by a lot of people, like, for instance, Kristen Hawkes, founder of the grandmother hypothesis, who essentially says that Hadza men will pass up a chance at a rock hyrax and come home empty-handed so that they can have more chance to get their giraffe. And we don't see that. They're eating mice sometimes. They're just doing whatever they can do. And so, yeah, so it's not...
Small game is...
below, I think it's below 30 kilograms. Yeah, so about impala size, smaller than impala size.
So that includes dico and things like that.
Yeah, well, yeah, maybe.
But
Yeah.
that's still big, though. That's still very
That's still reasonably sized. So anything below 30 kilos was classified as small game. Yeah. So yeah, I guess that still could be reasonably big. But I don't think there were very many that were close to the 30 kilogram mark. There were a lot of 15 and under and a lot of way above 30. So for instance, an impala is usually like 55 kilos on average. These things are heavier than we tend to think of until you're staring at them in the face. Then they look kind of bigger and scarier than you'd imagine, even the friendly ones. All right. So the next thing I wanted to look at is, okay, so they don't get that much large game, but when they do get large game or small game, how much of it do they eat? What percentage of the animal do they eat before returning to camp? And what I found is they eat a lot more of the small game animal before returning to camp. And sometimes, in some cases, they eat all of it, and it never returns to camp, right? Whereas with large game, it's very often that they don't eat very much of it at all. And a lot of times what they eat is the stuff that's very difficult to carry. So you'd have to carry the whole rib cage, for instance, so they eat a lot of that stuff. They'll eat some intestines and things that are sloppy and hard to carry back, essentially. So large game is a peculiar, atypical thing, not the typical thing that characterizes the descriptions of these people so strongly in most of the literature. I mean, a lot of the literature is really talking about 31% of the 16%, if that makes sense.
Sorry, can I just Maureen, why don't you come over here, because there's lots of seats over here and everyone's all piling up at the other end. Thanks, sorry.
So
that's a small amount, it's a small percentage.
yeah, because I mean, if you look at only 16% of what they ate out of camp was meat. So, and then if you look at that, of that 16%, a lot of times if it's a large game animal, only 31% of it is eaten out. So they're really not being characterized, I think, in the way that makes the most amount of sense. So this is a visual kind of characterization. This is a guy hunting, this is a guy getting honey. I would say that they're gatherer hunters at best, not hunter-gatherers, because even the hunters are getting a lot more gathered foods than hunted foods, right? If 82% of what they're eating is coming from honey, then I think...
Sorry, again, go back to what Chris... Is that because there's the animals are getting fewer and fewer? Or?
It could be. It could be that this is affected by the large game, but it's not entirely clear that that's true because, well, essentially there's been no previous assessment like this ever. Now the large game animals in that area have been on a decline, but there are protections now in place that there weren't even 20 years ago. So the question is, how quickly has it changed, and has it changed dramatically from what it was 100 years ago or not? I can't answer that really, unfortunately. But you're right, it could be that the amount of meat would have been higher in the past, but all we can do is figure out what it is now. And now it's reasonably low. And this is just a pretty picture of a young guy getting honey. Widespread sharing of all foods acquired by men is critical, and so on and so forth. I'm thinking that this one is pretty much dead on its feet. They do share a lot. I'm sure it helps a lot, but that's, let's face it, not their ultimate goal if they're eating almost everything they need every single time they go out foraging and don't even basically come home and tell stories about it. So most foods don't return to camp to be shared. And this is something that's kind of new and needs to be considered, that whenever you're looking at ethnographies, and people are documenting the diet, and if it's coming from in camp and there's no statement about people eating out of camp, that you might be missing a huge percentage of the diet of a given people. Right, so then I wanted to look at variation in reproductive success in relation to people's productivity. And by productivity, I mean how many tubers can they dig, how good at digging tubers are they, or how good a hunter are they. Now for this part of research, basically what I did, I'll tell you about the assumptions first. So the assumptions here, remember, some of these have borne out in other data, is that hunters have higher reproductive success. They have more surviving offspring than worse hunters, controlled for age. That's out there in the literature. And the assumption here is that females are sort of dragged along genetically to live longer, because men take a long time to learn how to hunt effectively. And so essentially, women have been dragged along selected to live longer just because our genes are intermingled and so on and so forth. But the real selective pressure here is on men living longer, because it takes them a long time to learn how to hunt effectively. That's sort of part of this embodied capital hypothesis. For this piece of research, I didn't just look at the return rates of people. So I wanted to look at their hunting rates and their digging rates and so on and so forth. But we're missing a bunch of time and data, and there's so much variation between the regionality and the seasonality that eventually what I decided is the Hadza have a better idea about who's a better hunter and who's a better digger than I do. So I asked them, I know, it's crazy. I asked 92 women and 88 men to name the 3 best hunters and the 3 best tuber diggers in camp. And then I collected demographic interviews on those people, and we have kind of long-standing demographies on those people. And what I asked them essentially, they basically were able to answer it very easily. So what you're seeing here is 2 different illustrations of the same kind of data, which is over here, you see hunting, the 2 black lines kind of show the curve of hunting, peak hunting reputation, and the dotted lines are the women's peak curve for digging reputation. And as you can see, it's the same here. The dotted line are women. Women are peaking at about 63, and men are peaking at about 50 in terms of their reputations. So women are peaking roughly a decade after men in terms of their reputation, that their peak time of production reputation. So I thought, okay, well, that's really interesting, but maybe there's this whole thing about assortative mating. So what's assortative mating? It basically says, well, if you're a better hunter, you might be married to a better gatherer. And this can kind of, in turn, have effects about reputations and various other things. And so I looked to see whether better hunters were married to better gatherers or not. And they are. So these people are sort of teamed up. Some of the best hunters are married to the best gatherers, and so on and so forth. And then this is a bunch of numbers just to convince you that I've done models and there are numbers in them. But I'm going to tell you what it means. What I then looked at is a series of factors. So the number of children living, the number of children born, and the percent of children surviving to each person. And then I looked at that in correlation with women's digging reputations and men's hunting reputations controlled for age. And yes, it was statistically complex. But what came out of it essentially is that women's tuber digging reputations were associated with more children born and more children living. So better diggers had more kids born and more kids living, controlled for age. Men's hunting reputations were still significantly associated with more children born, but not more children living. Now remember, I just told you that better hunters are married to better diggers. So whatever strength because this men's hunting reputation is associated with more children born, but not more children living, it's very likely that the finding that better hunters have higher reproductive success is driven by their wives. So a lot of this attention that's been on the big game hunter, and he has higher reproductive success, and isn't he sexy? It's because they married the right one.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Before they get married, we don't know who's the, because the peak, if the female is at 63 and the male's at 50.
Yeah, that's a good question. How do they know? Yeah, I don't know. I don't know. But they say things. Now, Frank did this really interesting piece on mate preferences a long time ago, I think, maybe 2003 or something like that. And he had them free list things that they thought were important in choosing a mate or a partner. And both men and women said good character, hard worker. Those were really key. And I think probably it's not rocket science to dig for tubers. It's really a lot of hard work and character and going out when you don't want to and staying a little bit longer to get a little bit of extra food and so on and so forth. And I think maybe that's how they can tell. And I think over time that turns into expertise and a reputation for, you know, that's my best answer. I can't really say how they know. Yeah. But it's a really good question. Right. So, okay. Variation in reproductive success in relation to productivity as measured by their reputations over the lifespan. So the assumptions here were that better hunters had higher reproductive success. That's sort of true, but probably because better diggers that they're married to have higher reproductive success. Better diggers definitely did have higher reproductive success. And females are dragged along genetically because longevity has been selected for in males. Now I want you to return to this graph and think about how it would be that females are dragged along when they stay ahead of the curve a decade longer in terms of their production. That doesn't really make much sense. So if anything, you know, I don't think that there's a lot of support for this, let's say. That's why I give it an X. So what I tried to do is I tried to look at preferences for and importance of meat, the strategies of men, how much is obtained but not shared, and the variation in reproductive success in relation to men's and women's productivity. All right, so honey was the most preferred food by both sexes, but meat does seem to be important in terms of supporting women's body fat. So it seems that getting some help does help, right? It's not that surprising. Women not having to go out and dig for tubers and walk for a long time every day is a big deal. So Hadza women vary on average forage about 4.5 hours a day. And if they don't have to do that because men are bringing in enough calories via meat or honey or something else, then that actually does help their body condition and probably helps them with fertility and so on and so forth. However, that doesn't necessarily translate into meat being the only thing. Probably any kind of calories would help. Now, what about the strategies of men? A lot is eaten before being returned to share by the men. Most of their diet, actually, is eaten without anybody watching. I couldn't believe this, actually. And also, men are eating a ton of honey. I kind of want to look at their teeth again now. It should be that their teeth are just falling out like crazy.
Actually, you just mentioned the incredible variety of different types of honey.
Yeah.
Honey, you know.
Kanoa, Nateko, Ba'alako. And there's a lot of it. And women sometimes get honey when they're out as well, but men are just getting a huge amount of honey. All right, and then the variation in female productivity. Well, women's reproduction peaks roughly a decade after men's seems to.
Reputation.
Yeah, their reputation. And then I must say here that reputation, if I'm critiquing myself, it probably has a lag on reality because it probably takes 5 or 10 years to build up a reputation. However, I don't see any reason that the lag would be different for women than it would be for men. So my guess is they both probably peak a little bit earlier than the reputations peak.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I do think the Hadza are probably much better at figuring out who's a good hunter and who's a good digger than we are, based on returns over small periods of time when researchers are around. So I think this is the best proxy that I can get. All right, so both men and women, their production reputations were correlated. So this seems to be a big factor. And if you think about it, it probably makes a lot of sense that in this kind of area that the partnership is something that's a big feature and it's an important thing. And this is something that I think is very seldom talked about. It's talked about, oh, well, the grandmothers are provisioning, oh, the husbands are provisioning, but the team itself and how they're acting as a team strategically is seldom mentioned. And obviously they're selecting their partners very carefully, because otherwise you just wouldn't find this kind of pattern of the best hunters always being married to the best diggers. It would be a lot more noise. And then finally, best diggers had more children born and more living. And that was a much stronger effect for diggers than it was for hunters. So it's likely that what we're finding in some of these better hunters having higher reproductive success could be that they're choosing wives that, well, are more productive and more reproductive. So that's something that we're basically looking at. So the funny thing is that when I was thinking about the title for the talk, I'm looking at all these evolutionary theories that have all this kind of the helping and the supporting of female reproduction, but almost nobody is actually looking at female strategies for production or reproduction. Almost nobody's actually documenting differences in female behaviors and seeing how it comes out, which is strange. And there don't seem to be very many mother hypotheses of human evolution, even though it's obvious to the most basic ecological mind that... Yeah, that's true. But she's very into a cooperative breeding kind of paradigm. And I think first, before we jump onto this cooperative breeding thing where we're all in a little commune and everybody's helping the moms, let's at least look and see what the moms are doing differently from each other that might make a big difference. And how big does that difference make as compared to the kinds of help that they're receiving on top of that? Because I think, well, and most of us probably can say that there are single moms that people know that don't get a lot of help, and they still have a lot of...
That's the welfare state, and that's all kind of...
I know single Hadza moms who do it. But yeah. I mean, it's just a corrective. I haven't invented anything here, but it is a corrective that's, I think, very needed, because there are all these different seemingly conflicting theories. People get very stuck on who's doing the help. Is it the guy or is it her grandmother? And nobody's actually looking at variation in women's actual work. Variation in women's strategies. How are they going about it? What are they doing? What makes the most amount of difference? Or even just biological variation in women. But the women themselves, they've kind of gotten painted out of their own picture.
Yes.
So that's my argument, basically.
Sorry, can you sort of do a timeline on this? When do they reach puberty? When do they get married? When do they die?
Oh, the Hadza? Yeah. Okay, so they hit puberty usually at about 16.
Puberty?
Yeah. About
16?
Yeah, they hit puberty a bit late compared to Western educated, rich, industrialized kind of people. When do they get married? They get married usually right around then or a couple of years later, so maybe 18. When do they die? Well, if they survive the first couple of years, they usually die at around 75 or something like that, because infant mortality is very high, and so probably the average life expectancy is something like 35. But when people hear this average life expectancy, especially, I'm sure some of you have heard, in medieval times, everybody died at 35. Mm-hmm. But that's just an averaging of childhood mortality with the natural lifespan of about 75 for humans, which if you average a bunch of zeros and a bunch of 75s, you come up with 35, basically. So everybody, on average, dies at 35 until medicine keeps babies alive at a higher rate. But that doesn't mean that anybody actually dies at 35 unless they fall out of a tree or get killed by somebody. Does that make sense? Okay. Yeah. So
when is the infant mortality? Is it in the first year or?
It's in the first 2 years, really.
First 2 years.
Yeah, and that's one of the things. One of the things that I didn't really talk much about, but is in here, and I'm not going to it because I can just tell you about it. I'm going to leave you with that. Is that I looked at whether better diggers had higher percentage children surviving, or better hunters had higher percentage children surviving, and nobody seems to be able to affect the percent survivorship of their offspring. They're all doing their best, I think. It's just a matter of luck of the draw, who gets a parasite when, how vulnerable are they.
So the reproductive success is coming from more children born, increased fertility.
Yeah. So that's one of the key things here, is that it seems like it's likely that this fits in with Phyllis Lee. I don't know if any of you guys know, but she basically is seeing that these mothers have strategies to reduce their interbirth interval. So the amount of time that they have to spend nursing a kid to get a monkey kid, to get it up to a certain weight so that it's safe, so that it can start basically another kid. And I think that maybe this needs to be looked at in that same way. Maybe Hadza mothers have strategies to reduce their own interbirth intervals, and that's why they're doing better. Yeah.
Will Hadza have any trouble with predation from the hyenas, lions, leopards?
Yeah, they do. They do. So sometimes hyenas will break into a camp and steal kids. And I know one of my favorite Hadza has actually been attacked by a hyena, but it was a particularly bad year. And his wife fought it off of him. They're divorced now, but never mind. She was there for him then. But yeah, they do have some predation, but it's not huge rates or anything like that. It is an unusual thing because the Hadza are quite dangerous. They're the most dangerous thing going. Some poison arrows, they can, Yeah.
So the reputation survey, did you ask men about the best diggers and women about the best hunters?
Yeah.
And were they allowed to vote for their husband or wife?
No, they weren't. They weren't allowed to vote for their husbands.
Right, so they had to give an assessment of who in camp,
Yeah.
but not your husband.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Could that assessment of reputation be affected by the hunting strategies that the men are single on their own and often unwitnessed in their acts, and the women are together and therefore have more witnesses to their, if a woman pulls out a shoe the size of a crocodile, more women are going to see that, whereas if a man brings out a giraffe on his own, most people would just say, well, you might have found it dead already.
Maybe, but if you regularly find dead giraffes, you're still really lucky, so maybe you deserve your reputation. I don't know. I think over time, the fact is that the thing that is driving the reputation is exactly the thing that I said was this very small part of their diet.
Yeah.
So the most visible thing to do is large game hunting. What I'm essentially saying is that I think that the reputation that people get from doing that is valid, but I don't think that characterizes most of their diet or most of their behavior, if that makes sense. So, yeah.
It was a fantastic talk, and obviously the work desperately needed to be done. That measurement of women's own contributions on foraging needed to be done. And it is surprising it hasn't been done. Just sort of to kind of be fair to the theories you're criticising. Of course, those theories, the grandmothering hypothesis and the embodied capital, and they're grand theories, and they're about human evolution and origins, and they're making comparisons with non-human primates.
Yeah.
You wouldn't deny that, compared with chimpanzees, for example, where a female really is left on her own and has to do pretty much everything to get that baby up and running. Human childcare burdens are so great that you wouldn't be able to afford large brain babies if there wasn't an enormous amount of support. So,
well, and basically,
tending to say we can do it almost like an individual woman could do it, and I in the wider context of things, the grand scheme of things, it seems to me quite important to have an explanation for all the strange kinship alliances and rituals and things which do mean that women do get. They organise it themselves, of course, and women maybe could survive and bring up kids on their own, but I think they would certainly be better if they've got grandmother and husband and all those other things, simply because of more support.
I totally agree with that. Help helps. Yeah. However, I do think there hasn't been any attention paid to what is the variation in women's strategies.
Yeah.
Sure.
So we should definitely be looking at this. This is uniquely human, and it's important. But not before you figure out what she's doing herself.
Yeah,
and let's not paint her out of the picture and pretend like just because she pretended to faint that she couldn't have had other strategies at her fingertips that she decided not to employ because she has a husband or let's get back to, in some ways, let's get back to
But
the
related
basic
to all that
basics.
is, of course, the fact that with non-human primates, the males not only don't help, they actually could eat your baby or kill it or something. So there's a huge difference between what humans expect from males and what non-human
Oh
primates.
yeah, and I definitely am not saying that, human females would be just as well off alone. That's not at all what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is help helps. However, there's some very strong arguments being made by these sort of broad theoreticians without looking at the difference in women and just attributing every outcome to either her spouse or her mother.
Yeah.
But why don't we first tease apart what her strategy is and how they differ, the mother's strategies.
It's a very important point.
Yeah.
Maybe it's inadvertent, but isn't that war propaganda opposed to where women's production is for male warfare?
Yeah. It is. It's ironic.
It just made me think then, is there a relationship where women's production then is supporting the kind of male activities?
Well, yeah, that could be another argument
Yeah.
made. I don't think that men could necessarily, they might be able to hunt without women's provisioning, for
But
instance.
the question would be then about if there's a differential in how boys and girls are raised in this society. So that would be the question that's prompted by this maybe inadvertent.
No, this
Is
is
that purposeful?
this is quite purposeful. Yeah, I mean, both of them are actually examples of not essentially looking at female strategies for female purposes in some ways. And they're both also retro, which I like. But aesthetically, they went together.
But did you notice how boys and girls are brought up or
Yeah.
nourished by their, I'm surprised they don't do it themselves.
Well, so there are some interesting things that I haven't gotten to the bottom of, and I think that actually you and some of your students probably are further along with this stuff than I am. But I've seen girls actually play with bows and arrows, but they're not actively encouraged to do so. Let's put it that way. But I've seen them do it, and I've actually met a little boy who was actively encouraged to dig for tubers, which, yeah. So there are some. It's not that the Hadza are actively prohibiting crossovers of gendered work, but it does end up being that way. So exactly how the transmission of these sort of cultural roles in terms of productivity, that's basically what you're asking about, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm just wondering how that if women in general are supporting men, then how does that show in how boys and girls are raised? If they're raised differently, are they raised?
Oh yeah,
girls
they're
by
very
the
much
women
raised.
and
Yeah.
boys by the men. Are they spending their time with male society or female society?
It's a little more complicated than that. So boys are not really raised with men so much as with other boys. So there's just like gaggles of boys running around doing stuff together, like a tiny pack.
Same age cohort.
Yeah.
Much more than.
Yeah. So it's a little bit more complicated. Girls a lot of times do go digging with their mothers, and boys a lot of times are encouraged to hang out with their own age cohort and experiment with hunting and things like that. And it's okay when they're a little bit older, even like as old as 7 or 8, to kind of wander away a little bit from camp by themselves, whereas girls are very much more often kept close. There was a great study that showed that female chimps were much better at nut cracking at certain ages, but mostly because they stayed closer to their mothers. And a lot of people argued about whether that's biological or that's chimp culture. But I would say that that's similar in Hadza culture, that girls are encouraged to stay close and boys are encouraged to get the hell out of here, go play, get out of my hair. Whereas girls are tended to be encouraged to be useful and helpful and present. So I think that could probably spawn a lot of these differences that I don't see teaching explicitly happening, but this one general encouragement towards these two different directions can do a lot of work in and of itself, because that means boys are raised by boys.
So this kind of mirrors what we were talking about a week ago or so about marriage, matrilineal, that the women stay with the mothers, matrilocal, and the men come in.
Yeah.
Into the community, into the women, into the women. So if you're pushing the boys away, in effect, you're pushing them to find out.
Yeah.
And so the women stay and the men go. So it mirrors what's happening at that marriage level, at that.
Yeah, I think Frank Marlowe, my advisor, would have loved to hear you say that, because he's been arguing forever that he thinks that most hunter-gatherer societies are either matrilocal or ambilocal, which means they can go anywhere just because they need to be flexible.
Anywhere as long as the mother and daughter are close.
Basically, yeah. Whereas a lot of the arguments from, especially Kim Hill, who does the embodied capital hypothesis, the whole society structure he envisions is around men, and it's all about hunting around men, and everything is about men's selection for longevity, and so on and so forth. The whole story is very, very male-centric.
Perhaps say to everybody here that, I mean, that's just such an important point, that this patrilocal band model has been around for about 100 years, a complete, total dogma. George Lévi-Strauss, countless other people have said it's dogma. And it's just not true. These hunter-gatherers are, if anything, preponderantly matrilocal, certainly in the first years of life. And so yes, and of course it was Frank Marlowe, perhaps more than anybody else, who nailed that ridiculous myth with a wonderful
He did, but
cross-country.
people still cite the opposite viewpoint, which has the same data but interpreted absolutely the opposite. If you look at the data in the paper, it basically shows you that they're more matrilocal. But the guy in the paper goes on to conclude that they're actually not matrilocal. So it's like, how could this happen?
Because it's a Western model
It's called archaeology.
imposing. Western model imposed on hunter-gatherer.
There's some definite stuff going on with that, but whether it's Western or if it's sexist, I have no idea.
And just the last point on that is, as you already know, but I mean, the genetics, the long-term population genetics of hunter-gatherers across Africa totally proves that for tens of thousands of years, mothers have been living with mother. So the genetics is indisputable now, and yet still, as you say, the ideology just lingers on and it won't go away. It's politics, obviously.
Yeah, this talk should never have to happen.
Yes.
It should have been done decades and decades and decades ago. But it wasn't, so,
I'm a bit ignorant of this, but how is Hadza sort of group society organised? Who runs things?
Where's the government? Who's in charge?
I was just thinking that it sounds almost like, it sounds almost like if you had a man walking around sort of imposing himself on women who basically say, look, we can survive without you, sort off and just leave.
That's what they do sometimes, they're egalitarian, so anybody who thinks somebody's bossing somebody else around can just get up and leave. So for instance, I was in a camp one time where essentially there was one guy who was being a jerk, and we woke up the next day with an almost empty camp, just the jerk and us. We're going to move too. It takes us longer because we have more stuff. We have tents and stuff. They just slip off into the night, basically, and it's done. And they just,
Vote with the feet.
Yeah, they vote. That's the old saying. Is egalitarian people, which are a lot of hunter-gatherer societies, they vote with their feet.
Yeah.
A lot of people confuse this for democracy. So democracy is very different than what they're doing. Egalitarianism is, okay, so for democracy, if 99% of you guys all want George W. Bush as your president, then I have to go along with it. Egalitarianism says, if all of you guys want George W. Bush as your president and I don't want it, I leave so that he's not my president. So that's how egalitarianism works. And so
It was sort of, a horrible question for anyone who's anthropological here, but I was almost wondering in my head, I was a thought experiment, I was thinking, what would happen in a Hadza group if one day they woke up and all the men would mysteriously vanish in the night and the women were left? Would they survive, or would they just, by the sound of it, they would?
I think so.
I think they do fine.
I think they would too. I think it would take them a couple days before they realized that the men were coming back, I think. Because it's not unusual for them to disappear for a couple days, actually. Yeah. So I think they would just be like,
I think they'd probably come back at some stage.
yeah, well, yeah. Men always do seem to, don't they?
Shall we leave it for now?
Yeah, that would be great.